Okay, so today we're beginning our discussion of World War I, and we're talking about how did the creation of alliances among the great powers set the stage for war. So now, if you might remember from Miss Francis's class, let me just do this as a blank slide, or Mr. Amato's class, or whoever you might have had for 8th grade social studies, when you were talking about World War I, you always talk about mania as being the causes of World War I. Mania being, oh God, I gotta spell on the top of my head. Militarism. I might be spelling that wrong. I am really spelling militarism wrong. I apologize. That should be militarism, and it's not spelled right. But it's militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination. So today we're going to talk about the alliances and how the alliances really kind of set it all up, that the only option to happen was for Europe to go to war. I should also make the distinction that I think World War I is one of the most pointless wars in the history of wars. Millions upon millions upon millions of people died. A whole generation of Europeans completely wiped out for something that I think was really kind of very foolish. We'll talk about that more as we get through this. But the first question is, why would Bismarck feel the need to make alliances with other countries? So first off, you might be like, well, who the heck is Bismarck? Otto von Bismarck was the Chancellor of Germany. He was the guy who, well, he was from the country of Prussia, the region of Prussia, which was part of Germany, and he was instrumental in the unification of Germany. And he was a really gifted diplomat. He was willing to use war to get what he wanted. One of his famous quotes is, in order to get Germany unified, he will use blood and he will use iron. So Bismarck helps to get Germany united and under the power of Prussia, and he becomes the Chancellor of Germany. Now, when Germany becomes unified, almost immediately, it took on a massive program of industrialization. It was the center of the Second Industrial Revolution, and it pretty quickly becomes one of the most powerful countries in Europe. Because if you look at the map here, and you notice where Germany is, much bigger. Why is my pen not working? Oh, come on, pen. It's a much bigger Germany than we have today. There are, and we can't really see it on this map, but there are many, many rivers like the Rhine and the Danube that go through Germany, so it makes it very navigable. It has lots of natural resources like iron and coal, and so it becomes pretty powerful pretty quickly, which completely upsets the balance of power in Europe. And you kind of could get this idea if you've heard me mention this in class. European politics is a really tricky thing. They're constantly fighting with each other. They're constantly ganging up on each other. They never like it when a new country shows up and tries to kind of take any type of power. So Bismarck knew this, and he realized that Germany was in a precarious situation because they were still a new country. They're still trying to work out their government and do everything like that. And at the same time, he realized that they were a target because they were becoming very powerful. So he felt that alliances would make it easier for Germany to protect themselves. So his major goal in getting Germany aligned with other countries was not to bring war to Germany, but to protect Germany, and felt it would work as a deterrent in order to prevent Germany from being preyed upon by the other European powers. At the same time, you have the King of Germany, the Kaiser, who wants to make Germany powerful. He felt that Germany should have their quote-unquote place in the sun, and it should be allowed to have some of the power and glory that Britain has. So there's a little bit of a struggle within the German government as to what they felt Germany's role should be. Bismarck really wanted to avoid war. I mean, that's why he does the whole Berlin Conference in 1884. What's a way that Germany can get themselves an empire and start to gain some influence and power, but at the same time not get involved in any sort of war? Hey, everyone come to Berlin, hang out, and we'll carve up Africa. So the other issue is the Germans realize that their major competitor, if they're going to be really powerful, their major competitor is Britain. So they already were starting to kind of annoy the British in some ways, because the Germans were selling their products that they were making in their factories unfairly low in order to kind of push into the market that Britain already controlled, and the British already were kind of upset with the Germans because they didn't like the fact that they felt that the Germans were playing games with the market. So Bismarck knew, like I said, that, after making kind of somewhat of an enemy with Britain, that they were in a precarious situation. So basically, it's Bismarck that's going to start making some major alliances. And so the first country that Germany is going to make an alliance with in 1879 is going to be Austria. And there's a couple of reasons why they look to Austria first. The first and most obvious, they border them. They share a rather large border with them. So it's a good alliance to make with each other because they'd be close to each other if in fact there was a war. Second thing, Austrians speak German. And at one point, it was believed that Austria would have been part of a unified Germany. Austria, though, is not just made up of Austrians who are German-speaking. It's a multinational, multicultural empire, and so that's one of the reasons why Austria kind of gets pushed out of a unified Germany. But many people within Germany felt that Austria should be a part of Germany, so there is a cultural relationship there, historical relationship. So that's why in 1879 he makes an alliance with Austria. In 1882... they add Italy. So Italy gets brought into this game because now you have this, basically this Central European bloc. So if they happen to get into any sort of war, they would have all these friendly countries surrounding them. And this is something that's referred to as the Triple Alliance. And that's Germany, Austria, and Italy. So basically, his goal, though, was to isolate France. So the French and the Germans do not particularly care for each other. So the French and the Germans have fought, throughout their history, they have fought wars over the lands kind of on the border of area in particular called Alsace and Lorraine. These are two separate regions on the border of France and Germany that have literally been going back and forth between France and Germany since the time of Louis XIV, so since the 1700s. In addition to that, in 1871, the French and the Germans fight a war, the Franco-Prussian War, in which France is humiliatedly defeated. Germany manages to march into Paris and surround Paris and overthrow Napoleon III, who was the emperor at the time, and so that there's bad blood between the French and the Germans. So Bismarck wants to isolate France, and he wants to make sure that there does not become an alliance between Britain and France, because he feels that would be really bad. And he also kind of wants to make sure that, let me erase Alsace and Lorraine for a second here. They also want to make sure that Russia does not become aligned with France, because if Russia and France become aligned with each other, then if there was a war, Germany has to fight a two-front war, which they really don't want to do, because that would basically mean they'd have to fight essentially two wars at the same time. So Bismarck had a problem here, and this kind of shows in some ways the diplomatic genius of Bismarck, because the Austrians and the Russians do not like each other, because they're always in conflict over the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So because the Ottoman Empire, we know, is the sick man of Europe, the Austrians and the Russians have been kind of slicing pieces off of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. There's bad blood between the Austrians and the Russians. So Bismarck wants to try to keep Austria happy, at the same time keep Russia happy and keep Russia on his side. So he makes a separate treaty with Russia that was secret. And so the Austrians did not know about this treaty, but for a time, Germany was aligned with Austria, Italy, and Russia in an attempt to kind of make sure that Russia and France never become aligned with each other, at the same time trying to keep bad blood going between the French and the British so that they wouldn't align with each other. All for the purpose of keeping Germany out of war. Now, this actually worked pretty well until the Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, or Kaiser William II, or Emperor William II, it depends on how you want to say it. Kaiser is the German term for king or Caesar. Wilhelm is the German word for William. So sometimes you see him as Emperor William II, sometimes you see him as Kaiser William II. But in either which way, in 1890, he took over foreign policy in Germany. He basically pushes Bismarck out of power. He wanted to increase Germany's power. He did not like that Bismarck's foreign policy he felt was too restrained, and it wasn't allowing Germany to really kind of gain full, it's full with what he calls the place in the sun. That's like kind of his famous quote that Germany should have its place in the sun. So he pushes Bismarck out. He kind of ends William's policy of restraint. Other major thing that he does in 1898 is he begins to build a navy. So the Germans, having a North Sea coast, wanting to rival the power of Britain, realized that the navy is going to be a really important thing for them. Now, this began a naval race, which actually gets us back to mania for a second, and my really, I don't know how I misspelled militarism that badly. I don't even know how to fix it. Which takes us to, though, the M part of mania, which is militarism. So what we start to see is a naval race develop between the Germans and the British, because the British always felt that since they are an island, they need to be the biggest naval power in the world. And they didn't like the fact that the Germans were beginning to build up their navy. So now in 1898, it's not that big of a deal. By 1912, the German navy was big enough that it was a threat to Britain. And Britain did not like this. Britain felt that, well, since we're an island, we need to protect our colonies, we need to secure our trade, we are dependent upon imports, because if we are cut off from the world, we cannot feed our nation. We need to be able to control the sea in peace and in war. So they were not happy with the Germans building up a navy. So this creates a naval race, because the Germans are building more ships, and the British are like, well, we don't know what the Germans are up to, but we're just going to keep building more ships so that we still have a bigger navy than the Germans. So the last question is, why would William's policy allow for the creation of the Triple Entente? So now, basically, when William ended his policy of restraint that Bismarck had followed, one of the first things he does is he breaks the alliance with Russia, because he feels that they have a stronger loyalty to Austria, and it's being disrespectful to the Austrians to keep this secret alliance with Russia. So he breaks ties with Russia. And the Russians are like, well, we weren't even doing anything. We didn't do anything to annoy you. We don't understand why you did this. We don't like it. So Russia, why is my pen not working? Sorry. Russia does exactly what Bismarck had feared, and they align with France in 1894. So in 1894, France and Russia become allies. France doesn't like that Germany is building up all these allies. Russia is annoyed that the Germans broke the alliance with them, and they're kind of like insulted, and so they decide to align with each other, not necessarily because they're such great friends, but they're like, we don't know what Germany's up to, and we better just begin to protect ourselves. Now, France and Britain, even though historically they have always been enemies, were aligned with each other. And the French were trying to convince the French were trying to convince the British to make an alliance with the Russians. And the British were very hesitant to make an alliance with Russia because their governments are just so different. The British, by the 1900s, really is a democracy. By the late 1800s, they give universal male suffrage. The House of Commons becomes the more dominant house in Parliament. So essentially, Britain is a democracy, and a democracy with some of the monarchy, but they're a democracy. And they look over at Russia, which is this autocratic nation where the Tsar has all the power and answers to no one, and the British is like, we're just too far politically for us to be in alliance with each other. Now, though that attitude towards Russia changes with the revolution of 1905. Now, we didn't really talk about this in class yet, but in 1905, there is a major revolution in Russia, and the Tsar is forced to give some power to the people, and he creates a Duma. I'll spell that for you. I think my pen's working. A Duma, which is essentially a legislature. So he starts a Duma. He begins to limit some of his power because of the uprising in 1905. And so the British are like, well, at least the Russians are kind of moving towards a more representative government. So therefore, in 1907, the British decide to align with Russia, creating something called the Triple, I don't have to spell it, it's already in there for you, called the Triple Entente. So the Triple Entente is created in 1907. And so essentially Germany's policies kind of brought about the alliances that Bismarck was working so hard to prevent. And so here you can see this very complex system of alliances that we have developing in Europe leading up to World War I. So I want you to think about this question: were these alliances really protecting the peace in Europe?